Howdy folks, and welcome back to World of Warships with Rear Admiral Jingles. And today we have a battle with some interesting moments. Yes, interesting. That's the word we're going to use. This is Vizima in the Musashi with a very bling bling skin. Tier 9 Japanese free XP battleship. It's a Tier 10 battle. Oh, we don't see those too often. The Piotr Bagrations, or however you pronounce them. I just called them boobies. Yeah, I'm probably going to have to explain that one. It's a bit like Cockney rhyming slang. Now, Cockney rhyming slang is almost impossible to decipher unless you already know or somebody explains it to you. For example, in Cockney rhyming slang, your wife is your trouble and strife, the stairs are the apples and pears, and so on and so on and so on. That's why it's called rhyming slang. But the way Cockneys say it, they leave out the part that rhymes to deliberately make it difficult to understand. So, for example, you might say, I have to go and talk to the trouble, instead of trouble and strife. For wife, you might say, I'm off up the apples, instead of up the apples and pears. Yeah? Cockneys are just awkward like that. Well, it's kind of the same thing with the Piotr Bagration, because it's spelt bag ration. And babies' bag rations are boobies. So, get it? Yeah. I told you it would make sense, but it did require a bit of an explanation. So I fully expect everybody to start referring to that particular Russian cruiser as the boobies from now on. Although I don't expect it to catch on, because nobody would get it if they hadn't seen this video. You never know. It might catch on, but probably not. Right, anyway. I did say that there were going to be some interesting moments in this battle. And one of the reasons why it's going to be interesting is because there's one player, and don't forget this is a Tier 10 domination battle on the Sea of Fortune map, and there's one player on the enemy team, and there he is, in the ARP Yamato, with 24 battles played. 22 of them in that ship. Now, not everybody who has that ship is an utter noob. I'm sure that there are some filthy whales with thousands of battles played. You've also forked over more than $100 for the ARP Yamato. But that guy is not one of them. 24 battles played, 22 in the Yamato. He has exactly 3 ships in World of Warships, and they're all premiums. The Yamato, the Dresden, and the ARP Takao. He has a 36% win rate in the Yamato. I mean, of course he does. He's never played the game before, and suddenly he's sailing a Tier 10 battleship. Nobody would expect him to be any good. Of course he's going to be terrible. It's not that he's never sunk a ship. He has. But he has to die 3 times for every ship that he sinks. He's terrible. Of course he is. And it's not his fault. Now, I blame Wargaming. Do you remember the first Arpeggio of Blue Steel collaboration that Wargaming did? Where every single one of the ships you could earn just by playing the game? My, how times have moved on. I suppose it makes sense. I mean, 5 years ago, Wargaming's incentive was to get people playing the game, and one of the ways they incentivised that was by giving away free ships just for playing. You might say that 5 years on, it's no longer about bringing new players in, it's all about making the maximum amount of money out of the ones that you have, but, well, I'm not saying that's not true, but they clearly are bringing new players in. That guy's only got 24 battles played, and they're all in premium ships. I guess the point here is that nobody's saying that bringing new players into the game is bad. I mean, of course it isn't. It's always going to be a good thing. Well, not always a good thing. I mean, generally, yes. But you can't deny... I mean, you look at any brand new game that's achieved success, whether that's World of Warships, Elite Dangerous, whatever. Initially, the people who are playing are enthusiasts. Right? They're invested in the subject matter, whether that be 20th century warships or science fiction spaceships. They're people who care about the subject of the game, and they have an unusually high level of playtime and commitment. And this is going to be your core audience, and these are people who are going to preach the virtues of the game to anybody who will listen. There's a term for these kind of players. Actually, Soviet Womble did a very, very good video on this subject quite recently. Actually, a series of videos on this subject. These are your video game evangelists. Right, they get into a game early, they love it, and they will not shut up telling everybody how good it is. And these are good people to have on your side in the early stages of a game's release, because they bring in a large number of other players. The problem is when you start pissing these people off, when you start taking the game in a direction that they don't like, or that you promised them you wouldn't, but you go ahead and do anyway, when you start to make constant changes to the game that don't seem to make much sense to your core dedicated player base, other than from a we need to make more money out of you perspective, then these players, the ones who were your most valuable resource in the early stages of the game's release, become your biggest enemy. Don't forget, we're talking about the segment of the player base that had the most time to dedicate to playing and promoting your game in the early days, in the honeymoon period. In the early stages of the game's release, when you as a developer were bending over backwards to satisfy the needs and desires of these people, because they were basically 90% of your audience. But then time moves on, and if you're lucky as a developer, your game starts appealing to a more mainstream audience. A mainstream audience who aren't necessarily as committed or invested to the game as the original core audience who supported you during the launch. Now, as a developer, this is where you have to start walking the tightrope, because you don't want that hardcore early audience to start to feel marginalised, but you kind of have to start catering towards your now much more casual audience. And that's a really tricky path to follow. And woe betide the developer who gets it wrong. Because all of those guys who committed all of that time and effort to supporting your game at launch, you start to piss them off, you make them feel marginalised, you start giving the impression that you don't actually care about the long-term health of the game now that you have a mainstream audience and all you want to do is make the maximum amount of money out of them, and that same group of people who championed your game in the early stages will move heaven and earth to tell everybody how much you suck as a developer. Is this what's happening in World of Warships? Well, I'm not saying it is, but I'm also not saying it isn't. I'm a firm believer in simply presenting the evidence and allowing you, because most of you, at least according to my YouTube demographics, are adults, allowing you to draw your own conclusions. So let's take a look at the evidence. First, the aircraft carrier rework. I didn't think it was possible for Wargaming to introduce a class of vehicle into one of their games that I would hate more than I hated artillery in World of Tanks, but World of Warships managed to do it with the aircraft carrier rework. Now, in their favour, you cannot deny that they have actually achieved everything that they set out to do with the aircraft carrier rework, which was to close the skill gap between the 5% of aircraft carrier players who were good and everybody else. And they've done that by dumbing it down to such a level that any idiot can play an aircraft carrier and do reasonably well. So in that respect, they have definitely achieved one of the things that they set out to do with the aircraft carrier rework. One of the other things that they set out to do was to make aircraft carriers more popular. No, don't laugh. They have also achieved this. No, really, don't laugh. You see, it depends how you define popularity. Because we're not talking about whether or not everybody likes playing against aircraft carriers. We're talking about the number of people who are playing aircraft carriers. And in that respect, Wargaming have absolutely, unarguably made aircraft carriers more popular, because there are more people playing aircraft carriers now, because aircraft carriers are so ridiculously powerful and have so much influence that you barely need to know how to play in order to do well in them. Because of that, there are more people playing aircraft carriers now than at any previous point in World of Warships history. So, judging the situation based on that metric for popularity, then yes, aircraft carriers are more popular now than they have ever been. It all depends on how you define popularity, but basing it on that particular criteria, how many people are playing aircraft carriers, then yes, Wargaming have achieved the second thing that they set out to do with the aircraft carrier rework, and they have made aircraft carriers, I can't believe I'm saying this with a straight face, more popular. The third and final thing that they set out to do with aircraft carriers was to try to close the disconnect between what it was like playing a destroyer, cruiser and a battleship versus what it was like playing an aircraft carrier, because prior to the CV rework, playing an aircraft carrier was more like playing Command and Conquer. It was a top-down, real-time strategy game. It was literally as if you weren't even playing the same game as everybody in destroyers, cruisers and battleships, and so they took away the top-down view and they gave you control of individual squadrons, which do kind of operate more or less sort of a bit like cruisers, destroyers and battleships, except, you know, obviously way faster because they're aircraft. So in that respect, Wargaming are 3 for 3. They've achieved everything that they set out to do with the aircraft carrier rework. The problem is that they should have had a fourth goal, ensuring that aircraft carriers were fun to play against. Because if that had been the fourth thing that they'd set out to do, they have completely, utterly and miserably failed, and even a year later they still continue to fail at it. Hopefully I don't need to remind everybody of the horrific struggle that destroyer captains had to endure as part of the aircraft carrier experience when the CV rework went live. Now, to give Wargaming credit where credit is due, they have addressed some of the concerns of destroyer captains, and the situation for destroyers where aircraft carriers are concerned isn't quite as bad as it was 2 years ago. In the meantime, however, all Wargaming seemed to have really achieved with the interaction between aircraft carriers and other classes of ships is simply spread the misery around. Now it's no longer just the destroyers who groan in exasperation every time they hit the battle button and say there's a carrier on the enemy team. With the introduction of armor-piercing bombs, battleships got to join in the fun. And now, with the introduction of armor-piercing rockets, it's party time for the cruisers as well. Now, people might say, well, why shouldn't aircraft carriers enjoy the ability to do huge amounts of damage if they make a perfect attack run in the same way that destroyers, cruisers and battleships enjoy the ability to do huge amounts of damage if they manage to catch the broadside of an enemy? And that is a good question. Oh, and there's our friend in the ARP, Yamato. 24 battles played, remember? Tier 10 battleship. Actually, probably less than 24 battles played at the time this was recorded. He's doing very well, isn't he? Don't worry, we'll be coming back to him later. But yes, why shouldn't aircraft carriers get the opportunity to do huge amounts of chunk damage like that under the right circumstances? You know, if they put the time and the effort in the same way that if a destroyer, cruiser or battleship captain puts the time and the effort in, then why shouldn't aircraft carriers also have the opportunity to do massive chunks of damage? I do think that's a very good question, and it deserves a very good answer. And my answer to that question would be this. Aircraft carriers are so easy to play that an aircraft carrier does not have to put in the same level of time and effort to get the perfect shot off against a target that a cruiser, destroyer or battleship does. Because a surface ship has to work significantly harder and take exponentially longer to get into a good position from which it's capable of doing huge amounts of damage. I've lost count, and I'm sure you have too, of the number of videos that I have uploaded of World of Warships, where a player in a cruiser, destroyer or battleship will usually spend at least the first half of the game working for the positional advantage to get themselves into a spot where they can start to take advantage of a crossfire and start to rack up those huge damage numbers. A squadron of aircraft can do that right from the start of the game, every time. If a squadron of aircraft are making an attack run on a surface ship and the aircraft carrier player doesn't like the angle, he can spend 15 seconds coming in from another angle. And the sad truth of the matter is that because the punishment for not executing a perfect attack is so laughable, most aircraft carrier players don't even bother to take the time that it's required to skirt around the anti-aircraft zone of a ship, and instead they just fly right over the top and come in from the other side. So what's the counterplay to that? It's not your anti-aircraft guns, because carriers have respawning aircraft and surface ships do not have respawning anti-aircraft guns. As the battle goes on, yes, depending on how wasteful the carrier has been of his aircraft, they might start to not be able to field full squadrons, but your ability to deal with those depleted squadrons is being reduced exponentially every time you get hit by a high explosive shell. Your anti-aircraft gun mounts get knocked out, and they don't come back, but the aircraft do. And at the stage in the battle where you've lost most of your anti-aircraft guns, you've probably lost most of your teammates as well, so the options for just sticking together to mass your mostly ineffective anti-aircraft fire are increasingly limited as well. So your anti-aircraft guns are not really a counter to aircraft, which is kind of ridiculous when I say that out loud. Anti-aircraft guns are not really a counter to aircraft. Holy shit. How did we get into this situation? Anyway, the other strategy put forward by Wargaming for countering aircraft, just stick together, is at least somewhat effective. In the first 5 minutes of a match, when everybody still has all of their anti-aircraft guns and they are all still close together. But you don't want everybody on your team to be sticking together in the first 5 minutes of a match, because you're giving up map control, and map control wins battles. You want everybody to be moving out, taking the objectives, setting up crossfires, getting themselves into position to dominate the map. So everybody sticking together for mutually overlapping zones of anti-aircraft fire support is, I suppose, arguably, counterplay to aircraft carriers in the first 5 minutes of a match when everybody still has all of their anti-aircraft guns, but it also pretty much guarantees that you hand over map control to the enemy team and are therefore pretty much guaranteed to lose the match. And in any case, Wargaming went ahead and undermined their own advice to stick together by nerfing the amount of firepower generated by mutually overlapping zones of anti-aircraft defence. So on the one hand they're saying you should just group up, and then with the other hand they're punishing you for grouping up by nerfing your effective grouped up firepower. Seems legit. So what is the counterplay? Don't say just dodge, we all know how well that worked out for destroyers. And don't say just angle, because it is impossible to angle against an attacker that has 10 times your speed. They can attack you from whatever angle they like, and if you try to angle against them, you're going to be given broadside to somebody who's usually armed with at least 8-inch and probably 16-inch guns, and that isn't going to work out too well for you either. The simple fact of the matter is, no matter how reluctant Wargaming may be to acknowledge this, is that there is no counterplay to aircraft carriers. You just have to endure them. And by that I don't mean you just have to put up with their existence as a class of playable ships in the game, although that's also true, but you just kind of have to take the hits, try to mitigate the damage, just try to endure until one team or the other wins. That's aircraft carrier counterplay in World of Warships as things currently stand. And then of course you have an entirely different can of worms with some of the Japanese carriers, and we're primarily talking about the Tier 10 Hakuryu here, whose torpedo bombers, with the correct build, can be so stealthy that they can even spot some destroyers without being spotted themselves. That's right. Simply giving all aircraft carriers the ability to spot pretty much your entire team whenever they choose, with zero risk to the aircraft carrier itself, isn't enough. Some of the Japanese carriers can spot you with zero risk to the aircraft doing the spotting. And even when you hand this much power to the aircraft carriers, you've still got aircraft carrier players who just refuse to use it. And as it happens, we have a perfect example of that going on in this very battle. If you've been paying attention to chat, you'll have noticed that the Midway on Vizima's team is refusing to spot the enemy carrier, and is only spotting him by accident as his aircraft approach and attack the enemy Yamato. Now, to be completely fair to the Midway player, this is somewhat understandable, because Wargaming continue to double down on their baffling decision to refuse to properly compensate people for spotting damage, which is naturally going to lead to people playing selfishly rather than doing whatever's best for their team in what's supposed to be a team game. It's not the Midway's fault, reprehensible though it may be. If you want people to play as a team, then you have to reward them for playing as a team. If you don't, they won't. This is not rocket science, this is basic team game design. So we have an aircraft carrier rebalance that is 100% successful, based purely on the parameters that Wargaming set for themselves, one of which was not to ensure that aircraft carriers were as much fun to play against as they were fun to play. We have a team game that's set up heavily skewed in favour of rewarding individual rather than team performance. And then Wargaming feigns surprise when everybody acts like a bunch of selfish dickheads. But hey, at least we are still bringing new players in. New players like this guy, in his Tier 10 battleship, with 24 games played. Now, I'm certainly not against new players coming in. I think it's vital for the long-term health of the game. I can't help but feel, however, that it would be better for the long-term health of the game if the new players were coming in at Tier 1, where it would be completely understandable that they have no idea what they're doing, rather than at Tier 10, where it's completely inexcusable that they have no idea what they're doing. Notwithstanding everything that I've just said over the course of the last 20 minutes, I would still encourage you all to make your own minds up. I mean, like I said, according to my YouTube demographics, the vast majority of you are responsible adults. Well, you're adults. Sorry. Couldn't resist it. I certainly don't design wildly successful computer games for a living, and I'm pretty sure the overwhelming majority of you don't either, but we do play them. And we know what we like and we know what we don't like. I'm simply presenting the facts as I see them. You may see them differently. If that's the case, then have your say in the comments. But I'm just presenting the facts as I see them. You go right ahead and draw your own conclusions. And I would love to know what you think about all of the topics that I've raised in today's video. That's what the comments section is for. If you have something that you want to get off your chest, I strongly encourage you to use it. In the meantime, Vizima, 3,500 base experience. Damn, son. Sounds like you had a pretty good game. I'm sorry we got sidetracked. Hopefully he won't mind too much. And I hope you've all enjoyed today's video, or at the very least, it's given you something to think, or more importantly, something to talk about. Because that is it for today. And as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.